Thank you very much indeed.
I'm thinking of writing a book at the moment because there's obviously a fashion for writing books that are called A History of the World in X, Y. And I'm always mulling over writing a book called A History of the World in 10 Advertising Slogans, because I think the very best advertising slogans actually contain deeper truths. Just as actually, if you look at language, quite a lot of what are kind of saws, sayings, proverbs actually contain a lot of wisdom in a very simple sentence. And, the mask. There was a strange argument about masks, and I never understood it because everybody else was practicing virology. And I was always in favor of mask wearing because I was actually a great believer in teskology, which is the belief that every little helps. And that it was unlikely to do any harm, and it was probably going to be beneficial. I never quite understood anti-maskers because they went around going, ooh, it's like the Nazis. And as a very brilliant comedian pointed out, yes, that's right, because that's what the Nazis are really famous for, imposing minor inconveniences on people, right? Okay. But there was a slogan for Sky a few years back, for Sky TV, called No Turning Back. And it struck me as fundamentally interesting because there are certain behaviours, and products actually, which are significant because once adopted or experienced, you can't imagine life without them. Now, there'll be about 10 or 15 people in the room who owns an air fryer at home. Okay, right, this is actually, it's growing, and by the way, you're early adopters. If you own an air fryer, you're almost certainly a slightly deranged evangelist who goes around to all your friends going, I can't believe you haven't got an air fryer. I bought an air fryer for my dad who was at the time 80. He's massively cynical, generally resistant to almost everything, but he's become this strange Wye Valley air fryer evangelist among the nonagenarians of the Welsh borders. Mattress toppers, anybody got one of those? Similar, okay? Right? Once you've experienced it, everybody else thinks you're nuts, okay? But once you've tried it, there's no going back. And when I think about it, having been born in 1965, for about the first 35, 40 years of my life, it was completely normal when you watched television that you couldn't pause it and that you had to watch the program at the very moment when it was broadcast. And we thought that was perfectly normal, okay? Now, if that was imposed on you now, you'd kind of go nuts because you've evolved into a system where you go, well, okay, I know that series. Did anybody see Manhunt on ITV, by the way? Yeah, written by my brother-in-law, I'm proud to say. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And I just decided, look, I won't watch it 4 nights in a row. We'll save it up, and then I'll watch it in one massive binge session. And it would be completely intolerable and weird for us to go back to watching television the way we did. I spoke to my grandmother about this, fascinatingly, and she explained to me, which I'd never grasped, because she'd grown up in the pre-television age, that when you went to the cinema to see Casablanca, as far as you were concerned, that was the only chance you had to watch that film ever in your life. The idea that you might have a second chance to see it simply never occurred to them. And I think what we've seen with remote working is a similar case of no turning back. There are Luddite elements out there who go, no, this is ridiculous, I want everybody back in the office. And you occasionally get people, usually in the sort of financialized part of the business, who are obsessed with returning to the status quo ante. But the truth of the matter is, I don't think you can. And the reason is very simply that once people have experienced a world where you can pause TV, I don't think you can take them back into a world where you can't. It simply starts to seem ridiculous. In the same way, I think that demanding that everything returns to exactly as it was before is a bit like the music industry's response to digitization. Once you'd experienced the possibility of downloading music online in 4 minutes, demanding that you wandered off to a shop and bought a CD and carried it home, and then scanned it into your device by, it was called ripping, it was called. Does anyone remember this? Okay, I'm showing my age here. Ripping the CD and transferring it onto your device. It just seemed kind of dumb. And pretending that you couldn't actually acknowledge that change in perception is just impossible. Now, I think why you have these no turning back things, why you have these things is that there are certain products and behaviors that are like an epiphany. They're effectively, like an awakening. You suddenly start noticing things that you never noticed before. And I think it's an interesting question to ask why we were so slow to adopt flexible working in the first place. I mean, I used to get slightly annoyed by staff who'd say, I had to get in really early because I had a lot of email to do. Okay? Kind of the point of the internet is that you can actually do things from anywhere. So if the emails were really that urgent, why didn't you do it yesterday evening? Or get up early, do the emails from home, and then travel into work on an empty train? Okay? Bit of a flexible working tip for all of you, by the way. I'll let you know this, because that means that you'll never say that my talk was a waste of time, okay? If you're traveling in an off-peak trains, okay, there is a clever scam you can practice anywhere in the southeast of England where you buy a season ticket, an annual season ticket. Mine's for the Isle of Wight between Ryde Esplanade and Ryde St John's Road, okay? It's the cheapest annual season ticket you can buy, which gets you a gold card. Okay, and that means you get a third off, first class off-peak returns, everything. Okay, I've never been to the Isle of Wight, but I own an annual season ticket there, so I can basically hack the rail company. I just thought I'd let you know that, because I thought it might be useful. But one of my great arguments with flexible working is, let's take this in a silly binary way, where it's all about there are days when you're in the office, there are days where you're not. If you can persuade just a chunk of people to work a bit from home in the morning and then travel in mid-afternoon, they save a fortune, okay? Quite simply, it's a huge, huge cost saving. Now, from a point of view of flexible working, there's the productivity question, but there's also the disposable income question. You may not want your staff to work flexibly, but I bet you sure as hell want your customers to be able to. Because what it represents, particularly for younger people, particularly in the southeast or around London, is potentially a massive increase in disposable discretionary income, equivalent to a fairly significant tax cut. What worries me is that our younger staff, effectively, after they've paid tax on any incremental amount of money we give them, 50% of what's left over disappears in transportation costs and accommodation costs. And I've tried to get the Ogilvy Finance Department to answer a very simple question, which is, in order to buy a member of staff a curry, how much do we have to earn from a client? In other words, what do we have to charge a client in order to give a member of staff a discretionary 20 quid? I still haven't got the answer, but it strikes me as just a really interesting question to ask. Because one of the huge things here is that, is anybody familiar with an economist called Henry George, a 19th century American economist? And he always made the argument, which I think is quite tenable, that if you have any activity which is tied to a particular place, any industrial or economic activity which has to take place in a specific location, most of the gains from the value created by that activity will ultimately accrue to landowners and not to the people performing the work. And I have to say, I think that's inarguably true. You know, if you're Pret at Heathrow Airport, the person really making money isn't the person making the sandwich, it's the person who owns the real estate. And so by using technology to liberate us from the requirements of centralized location, bad news for the Duke of Westminster, good news for your employees. And now, I'm not saying that's the only way to look at this. I'm simply saying it is a useful way to look at it, because nobody seems to be discussing that at the moment. What difference would it make? The other thing I think that's really interesting is I think people instinctively know how to make themselves productive. It was very interesting in Ogilvy because our creative department have become absolutely fanatical adherents of flexible working because they said, look, let's be honest, we prefer it and we produce better work faster. And I think a reason for that is there is quite a lot of knowledge work where you produce your best work by hacking your environment. Now, what we have done, and I think we did it inadvertently and very unintelligently, is we created a working environment in offices which was designed for the average, not for the extremes. Now, I was talking to John Cleese. I can really recommend his book, by the way, John Cleese's recent book called Creativity, A Short and Cheerful Guide. And he makes the point that one of the things you need for any kind of creativity is long periods of uninterrupted time. And everything in the open plan office actually militates against that. But the other thing about the open plan office is it doesn't give you any variety. It's the same everywhere. And my argument is, no. Actually, people who do creative work know that what you actually do is you produce your best work by actually oscillating between two extremes. In some ways, the job of creativity is actually the weird task of distracting yourself. You know, when I work from home and I'm stuck on something, I go and empty the dishwasher. And the argument is very simple. Either the change in behaviour helps you solve the problem, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, well, at least you've emptied the dishwasher. Okay. And I think that what we've done actually, largely actually, what it was, the open plan office, it was an attempt to save money on real estate, backed up by a load of entirely spurious pseudoscience about team working and collaboration. And actually, if you look at different people and different moods and different modes, people want the office to be a completely different thing. If you've got a really noisy home environment, you want the office to be a place where you can escape. And if you've got a lonely home environment, you want the opposite. So what you need is actually not this weird half and half, neither sociable nor solitude environment, which open plan creates. You actually want the two extremes. You want your office to be a mixture of a library and a pub, really. You know, because in other words, you want people to be able to actually choose the environment that suits them to produce the work, rather than imposing a uniform environment on them all the time. And actually, there was research done by Harvard Business School which showed that when you move people to an open plan office, the volume of intra-office email actually goes up, not down. Nobody has privacy in which to talk. People are terrified of disturbing other people. So the very conversations it's designed to facilitate actually get driven online. But I think there is something interesting. When I talk about this flexible working approach being a no turning back issue, I think people have actually realized things that weren't salient. It's interesting to ask the question, why did it take so long? Well, probably 8 years ago, the technology wasn't there yet. Not enough people had decent home broadband. Webcams were fairly rubbish on laptops. Skype was never quite as good after Microsoft bought it. Oops. But actually, for 5 years, this has been possible. And why didn't it happen? Well, there's something very interesting here to understand, which is that network products are different. They're odd. And I'm gonna slightly embarrass myself here, because I occasionally give this talk talking about the fax machine. And about 5 minutes into talking about the origins of the fax machine, I suddenly realized that about 30% of people in the room haven't got a clue what I'm talking about. Okay. But the fax machine, you won't believe, was actually invented in the 19th century. Existed in the 19th century. It was purchasable and usable all through the last century until the 1970s, early 80s. I had a friend who had a fax machine in his London office in the 70s. He also had a fax machine in his Los Angeles office. He could never remember sending a fax to anywhere except the other office. He didn't know anybody else with a fax. And so that's an interesting thing with network goods. Until they reach critical mass, they're useless. Owning the world's only fax machine is by definition completely pointless, because there's no one you can send a fax to. And the value of the device grows with the level of adoption and penetration. And what actually happened with the fax machine to a great extent is it was not COVID, it was a series of postal strikes in the 1980s, which drove all businesses to say, we have to have a plan B here if the post isn't running, so we better buy one of these things. And then, before the internet came along, it enjoyed a brief, anybody remember this? I'm sorry about this, I'm really old. But it had this brief heyday, basically in the late 80s, early 90s, along with something you never see anymore, which is the cycle courier, again, which in the late 80s, early 90s was absolutely ubiquitous. And so network technologies often require something like a jump start to get off the ground, because until they reach critical mass, now, what's happened here, I think, is very interesting. I occasionally talk to CocaCola, and I always say, what's magical about Coke? I think people often get brands wrong, by the way. A hell of a lot of brands is not what you think about, what you care about, what you love. It's what you don't have to think about, because you're so confident in the brand that you don't have to give it a moment's thought. And I always say to Coca-Cola, the magical property they have as Coke is that you can order a Coke anywhere in the world. See, pretty much apart from water, it's the only cold non-alcoholic drink that has this property. Okay? You can order a Coke anywhere in the world, and A, it doesn't seem remotely weird, and B, if they haven't got it, it's their fault, not yours. Okay? You can do that in a Tanzanian beach shack. You can do that in a Michelin-starred restaurant in Paris. Right? It's a really weird property. That is not true of Dr. Pepper, is it? Go into a Michelin-starred restaurant and ask for a Dr. Pepper Zero. Not only will they not have it, but they'll reply, "Monsieur, your vulgar, horrible tastes." You will basically feel embarrassed asking for it. What I think's happened, and it's very interesting, I was talking to someone from EY yesterday who said they've actually banned one-day and overnight travel, very interestingly. Now, I think people will game that system a little bit by saying, oh no, I need to be in Tahiti for 3 days. But anyway, we'll park that slight problem. But they've actually banned short-range travel. Now, what's interesting, I think, is that before the pandemic, video conferencing was Dr. Pepper and meeting in person was Coke. And I think now it's the other way around. The default mode is we'll meet over video. And the outlier mode is effectively, we'll actually make a journey and we'll travel. Very helpful phrase from PhD, a competitive agency of ours, but I'll mention them anyway because it's a good idea. They refer to 3 modes of human interaction, which is heads down, heads up, and heads together, which I think is quite a useful distinction to make. I think it's quite a useful phrase. But I'll end just before we go into the questions by saying that I always feel a large degree of awkwardness about this because in summer 2019, I met a very senior person at Zoom, and from our behavioural science perspective, we were asking a really weird question in 2019, which is how can we get more people to use video conferencing? And we did have an idea, which is create the behaviour in micro, synchronized, and see if it spreads. So we suggested Zoom Fridays. You make Friday a Zoom day. What I noticed with my team was fascinating, which is that at the time I said, by the way, on Friday you're totally free to work from home, no problem at all. Nobody did. I've just given you a basic privilege. Why is nobody doing anything? And then I realized that they saw it as a concession. And they didn't want to burn reputational brownie points by taking advantage of it too often. It was only when I said, no, you're not really understanding me. I'd prefer you to work from home on Friday, that people adopted the behavior. But then, as the fantastic lady from Zoom was leaving the room, just as she was leaving in summer 2019, I said, of course, what you really need is a major transport strike or a minor pandemic. I said, I'll put you in touch with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We'll sort you. No, I didn't say that. Okay? But it does occur to me as absolutely fascinating. I think we have to look at this as genie out of the bottle. There's a song from the First World War, an American music hall song, which says, how do we keep them down on the farm now that they've seen Paris? Which was the problem that you had to get people from Kansas who'd basically spent evenings out in Paris suddenly to be happy cleaning out the chicken coop. And I fundamentally think that there's something here where we need to take a completely fresh look at labour economics. Labour economics, the reason your pay is called compensation is that it's compensating you for loss of leisure. What I think we've realised is that the assumption of labour economics is people value money and they value free time. And work is simply a trade-off between the two. I think that's a ludicrous oversimplification. I think people value free when and free where just as much as they value free time. I learned this because I had a PA who was a single mum, and I said, okay, let's just make this work together. I keep weird hours, you have different needs, you may want to bunk off at 4 o'clock. I'd post my expenses to her home because she could do them when her son was asleep. I said, let's just make this work. Capitalism for the last 10 years has been looked at as an efficiency optimization game, okay? And capitalism to a degree is. But capitalism is principally valuable because it's a value discovery mechanism. We experiment, entrepreneurs, interesting people try new things. A lot of them fail. Sometimes we discover, as with portable television or mattress toppers, we discover a value that we never knew to ask for because we never even thought about it. I think people value the flexibility of when every bit as much as they value free time. If you look back on the worst weeks of your life, it's not the weeks when you're busiest, it's the weeks when you have no control of your time. And I think once we understand this more nuanced view of work, we can start to actually develop a much, much better relationship between employer and employee. Not to mention the final fact, I know you're desperate to ask the questions. If you look at it in macro, white-collar employment, I'm not saying, oh, isn't it terrible being a white-collar worker? Let's face it, we don't get heavy objects dropping on our heads. We don't have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. We don't get attacked by dogs, okay? White-collar employment's pretty cushy. But white-collar employment offered absolutely zero flexibility. If you're a single mum, if you're a carer, okay, if you wanted to work part-time, white-collar employment was historically terrible. It was 9 to 5, 5 days a week. My father always says the reason you can never get a plumber is that people who hate being tied down disproportionately like to become plumbers because they like to be able to drift around with a degree of autonomy. And actually, white-collar employment didn't offer anything like that. We can rethink a hell of a lot now. And I'll end on one thing. We can even rethink retirement. okay? How many people retire because they want to stop work, and how many people retire really because they want to stop commuting? It's a really serious question to ask. So thank you very much indeed.